So I'm going to pretend as if I am a journalist in my real life and actually ask questions. So Althea, I'm going to go to you because I think you can help set the stage for us as to how far we've come, right? Like, so where was the funding for gender justice work? Where was it 10 years ago?
Yeah. So this is a celebration. So I am going to share some trends, some evolutions in the field, some that are very positive. We can all talk about the negative ones that we've also seen. I'll share some of that. And also, given what we're up against right now, it's really easy to kind of sit in kind of the fear and the rage. And I am there with you, but I also want to share about like what we actually achieved over the last 10 years. So I would say an overarching theme from the last 10 years is one gender justice funding field that has seen both instability and both positive and negative disruption. We have seen bilateral funders, we have seen private foundation funders who have been in these spaces for long periods of time shift some of their practices, and we've seen new actors in the field, more recently corporate philanthropy, high net worth individuals. Some of the things that I would say like have changed very slowly over the last 10 years is we've seen an acceptance, a shift from thinking about the harms of kind of short-term project-based funding to really thinking about how do you fund any type of organization or set of actors who are working in the gender equality or gender justice space to actually be able to advance progress. That is kind of one slow movement. I would say another kind of change is moving from kind of narrow thematic funding, thinking about how are we going to change individual women, their knowledge, their attitudes, their behaviors, to really thinking about what are the interlocking systems of oppression that actually need to change. And so going from changing women to actually changing systems. Again, extremely slow movement, but these are some of the trends that I would say that we've seen in the field. Another trend is like with different initiatives like the Generation Equality Forum, other types of galvanizing in the field to bring in
Gender
money.
Collab, which you are a member of.
The Gender Funders Collab. One of the things.
Keely's right there.
That is true. One of the things is that there have been assumptions that there are new commitments, but is there a net gain in the amount of money coming in the field?
And does it overshadow your core objectives?
Exactly.
That new money.
Yes. I think some of the issues with the new money is this assumption that it's new money and not just new commitments to existing money. So that's one thing. I think whether or not the new money is better money. Is it a part of this evolution of trust, of flexibility, of long-term relationships? Are we just continuing on with the same type of really just inequitable and harmful funding practices? And I think the last trend is there's been greater attention to feminist movements, to women's funds. CoLab has played a really important role in that regard. Some bilateral agencies, some private foundations are contributing more money. But the mechanisms are continue to be like attention, is that if you're working through like intermediary organizations, what proportion of that money is actually reaching feminist movements? What is the structure of funding? Is it still project-based? Is there budget equity? Is there transparency? Are feminist movements at the table in proposal development conversations? So I think there is this overarching like positive story to tell, but we've also seen like negative disruption in terms of very long-standing actors and bilateral agencies and private foundation who have left the field, and still questions about whether or not the new money will actually be something that will be long-term.
So Sarah, I'm really interested in your experience because your decades of experience with philanthropy are in Africa, right? Where you can't excise giving from predominantly Western nations. from the post-colonial context that is being given in. So you, actually, I'm going to read it because it's a great quote. You said, not all philanthropic giving is just, and not all is based on equality. And as part of the Pan-African Feminist Initiative, you are doing some amazing work to disrupt that traditional model. And it feeds from that statement. So talk us through your experience of that disruption and what's working and what's not.
Okay. Well, I've been doing this for about 30 years, so I'm trying to condense it into...
Also because I've completely
2 minutes.
lost the time. So now I'm like, okay, we have...
being rushed up there. But anyway, I think the thing is that the real sort of vexed context around post-colonial experiences and the extent to which colonialism had actually deepened or had actually changed or had actually been disrupted. I think philanthropy makes a really good examination point from around that question. We were grappling with the extent to which philanthropy actually reinforces and mirrors some of the post-colonial discrimination. In our assessment as feminists, our measurement tool or our tool of assessment is the relationships in power and how that power is used to exclude or marginalize, and then what we do about it. Now, our experiences of one, Africa was very much regarded, I'm talking sort of 10 years ago, 10, 15 years ago, Africa was regarded within the context of a conversation around philanthropy only as a continent that received. There was an assumption that Africa's only useful role or only useful contribution to the conversation was around its experiences of receiving this benign aid, from the West. And so it was a very sort of, and I'm sort of précising, but I think in the main, it felt like a very sort of top-down, in which the problems that African women and African communities were experiencing were analyzed and decided in terms of what was needed. It was a very external, extractive gaze and prescription. Extractive gaze, that's yes. A great way of putting it. And it assumed that this was kindness. It was, and actually it was talked about as being kindness. We're giving to you from our surplus, and isn't it wonderful of us? And so you have to conform to what we think is the problem with you. And if you try to disrupt that by saying, actually, this is not our experience, you were silenced with, you are either not representing the needs of women in your communities. This is what the women in your communities look like. This is what they need, and you are not representing that. And so a very audacious thing was started on where we said, well, a number of issues. We have to make visible the, rich traditions of giving in Africa. We also have to challenge and disrupt this sort of top-down decision around what's good and around what's needed. We have to speak up and be part of that analysis, right? But we also have to ask questions of ourselves. To what extent are we being inclusive? To what extent are we seeing and recognizing the complete sort of diversity amongst us? as women and as gender diverse communities. And we were going to do that unapologetically. We were going to pitch our tents wherever these philanthropic conversations were happening, and we were going to say, this is the way we see it. And I think this is, the Harambee Ubuntu Feminist Philanthropist Initiative, which is run by two leading African, social justice African philanthropic institutions, Trust Africa and Urgent Action Africa, who are here in the audience. Everybody, yes. Everybody who have been pioneering this audacious initiative, again, to disrupt philanthropy and to bring in the sort of African traditions of collective engagement, giving through solidarity. Ubuntu, you are because I am. The fact that we may not be high net worth individuals, we may not be, rich countries, we may be poor as dirt, as other people see it, but that doesn't mean we don't give, right? And actually, Africa has given very, 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 very generously on all sorts of things. And what we were going to do is, what this initiative wants to do, I think, which is why I laud it so much, is one, address the resource justice questions. As we know, feminist movements on the continent receive disproportionately less or fewer of the philanthropic dollars that there are in social justice movements and Pan-African organizing. And again, Pan-African, a huge a body of work talking about the fact that we need an engagement as Africa as a whole to address some of the deeply rooted structural problems. The second thing that I see this initiative, and I think it's very critical at this point in time, is again, like I said, addressing those relationships of power in giving and advancing more models that are in line with the values that we purport to be advancing. Giving up some of our power, giving up, being humble, bringing humility back into the work we do. And I know in many philanthropic spaces, we are not rewarded for being humble and for saying we don't know, right? We're not rewarded for that. And so it's a very difficult thing to say, actually, I want to hand over the power to these people to decide how this is done and to decide what success looks like, because we are working with this very neoliberal monitoring and evaluation and impact assessment, and saying, actually, we don't know, we hand it over to you. And then, of course, the third thing is to just really bring to light the rich traditions of giving on the continent. And, so applause to West Africa, to Urgent Action Africa, who are working to raise a $25 million endowment and have partnered with the Gender Collab around how this can be done.
Can I jump in there? Because we're running out of time, unfortunately. So rather than go through the questions individually, I think you use the Gender Collab as an example, and it's a great example, because one of the things that is so restrictive to being able to express what you just described so eloquently, right? The picture you painted for us is this idea of single issue funding, or having to go as an individual organization and seek funding that is then project specific. So if we take that as something that the Gender Collab and other organizations have kind of come together to pitch for a pool of money, right, that people can then move into. So if we do rather, so I don't get killed, because time's running out, if we do rather, what would you change? What's not working? Cynthia, single issue funding, and what else needs to change?
I think it'll be hard to answer that question, honestly, Nima, without at least briefly mentioning the Equality Fund.
Yes, of course, which the collab, actually, the Gender Collab was
how it is that we try
yeah.
to do this work, I think, in terms of challenging some of the things that you're saying. It's quite funny being up here because I think my former colleague, as a 10th anniversary, I was on the other side of the table. We were then called Power, or they were then called Power, and I would always mention it because I'm still upset about the name change. Philanthropy, Advancing Women, Human Rights, Power. Okay, we won't. However, you know, back 10 years ago, the conversations when this community of private funders or programs within private foundation working on women's rights, then we're sort of discussing, you know, let's have a shared proposal format. Let's have a shared reporting format. And we spend a few meetings, etc., talking about this. And fast forward, 2017, 2018, you know, the Canadian government has a feminist, has a new prime minister, the government with a feminist international affairs policy, wanting to demonstrate their commitment through robustly, at least infusing a significant amount of funding to women's rights organizations and movements. At the time, Equality Fund existed as a rather small organization called Match International Fund, and the CEO, who's quite a visionary in this, you know, as part of the feminist organization, as part of the feminist funding community, went into discussions with those who felt that this was a really interesting opportunity for the one feminist fund existing in Canada. And the Gender Funders Collab played a pivotal role in ensuring that Match went from this 7 to 8, you know, I think 4 to 7 million annual budget to an organization that received 300 million out the door, 300 million Canadian. This is also unprecedented for a government to fully disperse. We know that governments will give you, you know, 1 year and then the government changes and then all of a sudden you have major problems because the policy changes. But the entire 300 has been dispersed as part of the model of investing as well as giving money. And to get to that point, it took the feminist funding community coming together with ideas, etc. What could this look like? Let us be as bold as we can. And then it took Gender Funders Collab to do advocacy, to put skin in the game, to say, you know what, we will put down 25 million. We will pre-commit 25 million if this scrappy organization gets this funding. And this was done when the Canadian government now convened and called all those that had applied for interviews. And Keely from Gender Funders Collab accompanied the folk at what is now Equality Fund to that meeting, which is where she said, you know, I'm representing a collaborative that is willing to put 25, starting with 25 million
So
on the table.
Empowered the
And that was a game changer, you know, because the Canadian government said, well, if another organization, would you? And they said, well, no, actually, this is for the feminist organizations and movements. So that is the kind of role and work and what that meant in terms of not only unlocking the Canadian government, we have continued that journey with the Gender Funders Collab. Since then, in terms of doing joint advocacy with them, with new partners, with new government partners. For example, I'm seeing, you know, I always think it's important as a feminist to recognize by name those who have been on this journey, those who have contributed really significantly. And I know I was not there at the origin of Equality Fund. I joined a few years later. But Keely accompanying the team to the organization, Monica doing the advocacy that she did within Ford Foundation, Wellspring and the leadership that Manisha, who heads the Women's Rights Program there, showed, as well as colleagues from the Oak Foundation. Like, those foundations are really instrumental from leveraging their networks, bringing the money to the table, etc. Now, to your question about the single issue and etc., what it meant of really co-creating and co-visioning the idea of a Equality Fund is that it then informed how we think about doing our grant making. We don't do thematic-based grant making. It is grant making that is aimed to respond to how it is the feminist organization, the field really is structured organizationally. So we have individual organizations, we have a funding stream that is issue agnostic, that is participatory, where we have advisors from around the world that we know with deep knowledge and context that make the decisions. We have our largest funding stream, which is to our peer feminist funds. So we're in partnership with about 30 of them at this stage. And that is a non-competitive one. It is stepping up and stepping back. We have one that recognizes networks, coalitions, and movements. And then finally, we have one on crises, because that is not something that we can ignore in this stage. And to your point earlier, Nima, about the role that feminist organizations and movements play in crisis response and the abysmally low resourcing that they get for it. So what this model has allowed us to do is really to live into the possibility of funding and meeting organizations where they're at, to do the work that they need to do in the ways that they need to do it. Now, if they're working on advancing a very specific issue, whether it be gender-based violence, whether it be keeping girls in school, they're able to do that. If what they need to be doing is coming together as communities to strategize, to network, or whatever else, they can do that too, because that is how we organize. And looking back, sort of, just again recalling my own work, 30 years September, I guess, it'll be. If I look back at the kinds of things we're able to do because we could convene, we could come together regionally, nationally, globally, across regions. That kind of funding is not really available anymore. It's very minimally available. We would not have been able to make the kinds of advances we made in the 90s with single issue funding. But once we got these great, sort of frameworks that we really push, move away from family planning to sexual and reproductive health and rights, that was a major win. That took women from around the world and feminists from around the world to convince governments, et cetera, to do that. And, after that, I think the shift was we would need to advance on very specific issues. If you look at the Beijing chapters, you can identify what those issues, some issues get more funding than others. But we find ourselves today at a time of extremely effective attacks from those who have a much narrower vision, I think, to be charitable, about rights.
Very charitable.
That is a very exclusive, as in exclusionary, not exclusive, exclusionary idea of
and
rights.
seizing back. Yeah.
Right, and we find ourselves in this moment, and I think it's fair to say that we're not as robust as we need to be in this moment in time. It is going to require a very different level of resourcing. That flexible and long-term resourcing is what it's going to require.
And there's an example that has worked.
Exactly, that is allowed. So we can do it within the scale that we are able to. I mean, the Equality Fund, in the less than 5 years that it has existed, because of large part due to the gender funders, COLA playing such a critical role, we have either dispersed or committed up to 80 million Canadian, so you can work it down a little bit for us. It's still very significant for a scrappy young organization that is building itself out and designing internal processes, etc., to over 800 organizations, not as Equality Fund alone. It is really important, again, we see ourselves as part of an ecosystem. It is our partnership with feminist funds that enables getting the resources out as far as it can, being able to fund very well-established partner organizations, be in partnership with the African Women's Development Fund, for example, with very new emerging funds, funds or organizations. Government funding, giving 5,000 grant versus a 500,000, it's the same requirements. So it doesn't necessarily make sense for Equality Fund to do that, nor are we best placed sitting up, we're not sitting in Canada, but we're not sitting in Africa, in many of the regions either. So, it's been able to go really far, really quickly, but we're still a drop in the water. I think it's really important, amazing work, I love it. And we need much, much more. We need to continue funding the very specific issues that need to be advanced, where we have a lot of lessons, preventing violence, etc. There's a significant body of work that is really important to keep doing, and in many other sectors. And at the same time, we need to robustly fund those activities that are not easily put in a log frame, that are not easily measured, but that we know are essential and are the backbone and are critical to all that other work on advancing, on preventing and reducing gender-based violence, for example, or getting girls and keeping girls in school.
Thank you. There were some very clear marching orders there. And a great example of success, right? Like very little excuses. So as we wrap up just to take from Cynthia's lead there, Althea, what would your marching orders be?
So, yes, to my peers, definitely a need for better funder coordination.
Yeah.
I think, what we've all shared is that some of the evolution in the field is that there needs to be, one, funding going to feminist movements. There needs to be funding that goes to feminist movements that's better funding. This is something that CoLab has really, really championed. Bringing funders together to be able to advocate together, to figure out what are the ways in which you integrate feminist funding practices, especially for like development funders like Hewlett. Rights-based funders, some of them have been doing this all along, these types of grant-making practices. But for newer funders coming into the field, for development funders who are making commitments to gender justice, it really is about creating a community where you can learn about how to do this. That means not just trying to integrate it in your programs, but making sure that your legal teams, your finance teams, your communications teams are on board to say that if we have a commitment to equity, if we have a commitment to gender justice, this is what it looks like in being in partnership with feminist movements. I would say also accountability mechanisms for funders. It's a whole conversation, but again, CoLab is a community of private philanthropy funders who are able to have at least some level of conversation, debate about what accountability can look like. So I think these types of spaces need to be encouraged, need to be funded, because that is just like one way in which accountability can happen. But we definitely need other very transparent ways of holding funders who've made commitments to gender justice accountable for those.
Yeah, absolutely. Sarah.
Wow, I think all has been said, really, but I think...
one key takeaway, just
yes.
if you could.
Okay, I think the world is in so much flux right now. And as has been rightly said, there is a lot of very well organized pushback against many of the gains that have been made over the years. I'm hearing Gambia wants to revoke female genital mutilation law. I don't get this, but and of course we've witnessed the trauma. Françoise is here from the African Women's Development Fund about what's happening in Ghana with the passing of the, what is it called? The family values, whatever it is.
Yeah, the family values law.
The family
they kept it
values are not strange thing in my country too. So my thing is that we cannot play around with these issues and tinker around with the question of money. It is so critical to continue to build these transnational movements of women. It takes investment and it takes a long time. It takes a great deal of humility and courage, because we don't know what the blueprint is for that, right? I mean, many of us talk like we do, but and there are many lessons to learn. But as we know, these are deeply political issues. They are not issues we tinker around with technical solutions. Although often in philanthropy, we like to present those tinkering, that tinkering as the great achievement that we have made in changing the lives of God knows who and who and who.
So rendering women as numbers.
Rendering women as, without agency, without ideas, who weren't doing anything until we came along to rescue them. And that's both, and philanthropy is in a really tight spot, especially those philanthropies that have to raise money in order to give it to them, because there's a diversity of philanthropic actors. But this thing now of, in this context, trying to offer quick win solutions as the long-term as the long-term fix to these problems, I would say we need to be very, 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 very careful of. I think that philanthropy at this time, when global relationships of power are in flux, should be the ones that advance ideas around a new multilateral engagement, around a new sort of global financial architecture that may render some philanthropies actually as
Say it.
Obsolete.
obsolete.
Sorry.
As obsolete.
Yeah.
Right? Because as much money as philanthropy has, and I'm talking about in this context of Africa, that is living this post-colonial reality, as much money as philanthropy has, it will not have the reach of the African state to be able to address the long-term problems that we have, right? And for many years, we've pretended that we can be an alternative to that state and be a much more effective. But for us as Africans, we are fighting for the souls of our state to be able to function and provide and do the role of the state. So, so we don't want a philanthropy that absolves the state of its responsibility. That's not social justice, right? We don't want you coming and showing your feathers off and saying how wonderful you have managed to educate 300 girls in a village. And isn't that wonderful, right? It is wonderful. But what does it mean long-term for justice, right? It's the state that should be doing this. It's the state that's doing this in these philanthropic nations, right? So let's advance, let's create space for different ideas, enrichment of our traditions and our culture, and advance that to the rest of the world, right, which doesn't seem to know how to do this. So that's the challenge I put to all of us. Thank you.
Pretty fantastic challenge. I have failed in my role as moderator because we are quite thoroughly over. But I mean, you guys enjoyed it. I definitely enjoyed it, and I'm sure you all share the sense of privilege that I feel that you are willing to give us some of your hard-earned knowledge this evening. And then just thank you also, just amazingly charismatic and funny. And who said feminists weren't fun? This is fantastic.
I haven't been to our parties.
Don't know about that. Also, thank you for saying colonialist more than I did. I'm gonna go tell my husband. Somebody else said post-colonial more times than I got it in. But this has been such a pleasure, and please join me in a round of applause.